All right, so I'm back here again with Rabbi Rappaport from Chicago, and this time we're here to discuss the topic of chumros on Pesach. Everyone's favorite topic. Everyone can't get enough. They love the chumros they grew up with so much. They can't stop talking about it out of sheer and pure delight. So that's what we're here to do as well. It's a topic I've looked into last year, this year, and I have found, at least personally, that what an important part for me is actually trying to properly trace these ideas all the way back to their source. I think most people, even myself included, just by default, by virtue of our upbringing, we tend to have a very narrow view of things. So we think about it in terms of, this is what my father did, this is what my grandfather did, this is what my in-laws do. Um, if you're Chabad, maybe you think, how far back do you think? Usually, the specific makaitis of how how to conduct oneself on Pesach usually don't go further back than the Rebbe Rashab. So 3 generations, the Rebbe Rashab, the Frierdiker Rebbe, and the Rebbe. And even then, the stories aren't necessarily one. There isn't necessarily one authorized source, so you sort of gotta gather information along the way. So you may come across details many years later that are surprising, that you weren't even familiar with. Uh, Even if you grow up in other kreisen. So if you let's say you identify as hardcore Satmar, hardcore bells, then again, because it's short, I assume it depends on how curious you are, how far back you go digging. I'm sure each kreis, each community writes stuff up, but the question is when they wrote it up and how accessible it is, etc. So I think most people are operating out of a very narrow window in terms of how did I feel about it when I was growing up? Did I like it? Did I not like it? Did it feel convenient? Did it feel inconvenient? How did my parents act, and what was their attitude towards it? I think in this day and age, especially, a lot of people are very conscious about the feelings, about how it made them feel, and then whether you want to continue, whether your maskana, your personal conclusion is that you want to continue, you want to perpetuate it. Is it out of good feelings? Is it out of feeling stuck, or do you want to run away from it? So that tends to be a lot of the discourse, a big percentage of the discourse. Uh, so speaking for myself, digging a bit further into it and realizing how much further back uh, many of the prominent chumras that we're familiar with, we'll get into how far back they go and what the origins are, what the reasons are. I think, at least for me, gave a lot of perspective, and with that more long-term 300, 4, 5, 6, 700 years of perspective, I think we can at least develop a better appreciation and have a more informed opinion to make as to what we want to do and how we feel about it.
Yeah, just a couple of examples that come to mind of things that I don't know if you're going to address these specific examples, and obviously part of I think the conversation is to find an overarching attitude and history rather than so much in specific details. But I think, like for example, people who didn't grow up in Lubavitch of the last generation or two would be shocked to see the way we in Lubavitch today practice the Chumrah of Gebrux. The extremes we go to, and even things that are made payers and not having on the table, etc. And the idach, I wouldn't be surprised if many people who grew up in Lubavitch have never heard of the minhag not to eat fish on Pesach,
Right. So
which in
this
other kreisen is very, very strong. So it's like,
Right. So you have other cries that have falsche fish, right? That's the
yeah, that
context for
well,
that?
yeah, that's Some people bring sich. I think could even be in Chabad as such mukherres to only eat fish that you've seen alive. But there's certainly many kreisen where fish is bali rab bali matzah and Pesach.
Right. Right. Yeah. So there are all kinds of chumras for Pesach. Not all of them go that far back. There definitely are many other chumras that are more recent. Obviously, gebracht is more recent. That's something we've discussed other years. I know you've recorded shiurim on it. I believe I may have recorded shiurim on it as well. Um, so each homer really does have to be examined separately. But what is surprising is how many of the homers that we associate and we think of in very narrow terms do actually have a very, very long history, a long pedigree, and that's a bit of what I want to get into on this occasion, but also to provide some general perspective as to how these chumras arose and what the attitude towards them is, and where some of the factions today, different attitudes that we're seeing today, how where they're coming from, and I don't know if I don't know if I can propose a theory as to what everyone should actually do. What decisions people should actually make for themselves. But let's see where we go with it. Um, so any discussion of Churmas on Pesach really has to start with kitniyot. For some reason, ever since I started frequenting online discussions, which at this point could be, I guess, about 20 years, one of the things you notice about online discussions is for some reason how much kitniyot disproportionately receives online hate. Clearly, I am assuming it's perhaps an overrepresentation of a certain type of person, certain type of faction online, but something you see consistently every year. It's like the dialogue, the discourse always returns to how difficult Kitniyot supposedly is, etc. But I guess before I even continue, I do want to give a sort of a general perspective, which is my parents didn't come from a Chabad background. They came from more a regular Flatbush yeshivish background, and they had been American for a number of generations. So they didn't really have growing up. They didn't have, as far as I know, any major hummus. They certainly ate many products of many kinds in the house. Obviously not kitniyos or anything like that. Um, and then when my parents became Chabad, so yeah, my father was went more or less along with the standard Chabad Chumras. My mother a little less. So there was somewhere of a pshara somewhere there in the middle. I didn't grow up feeling that we don't bring products into the house. That was sort of my personal upbringing. Then when I got married, I married into a proper Chabad family, and then I got to see the Chabad Chumras from the from a front row seat, and it probably took me a few years to fully come around on it. But I think at this point I've reached a place where I do truly appreciate it. Um, and yeah, I've spoken to my wife, to members of family, and there's almost this expression of if you have a positive feeling about it, then the fact that you have these limitations, that you have certain Pesachdik machalim, whether it's the plain potatoes or the plain chicken or whatever the machalim are, that itself becomes part of the charm of Pesach. If you appreciate it, obviously that's part of what I want to get into in terms of uh, how much one should be doing if one doesn't appreciate it. I think that I, what I'm trying to get to, or what I want to get to, is that appreciating it should be part of the equation. You should be doing it and appreciating it because you're doing it. Um, so doing it and not appreciating it is a bit tzarachian. But it is possible. I think in this discourse, that side doesn't get represented as much in these discussions. So it's sort of the two sides are presented as I don't know why we're doing this, but we have to do it versus I don't know why we're doing this, so let's not do it. As opposed to, there are definitely are people that to them that's part of the chain of the Yom Tif, and what to bring all of these treats and these desserts and all these products into the house, like it's not Pesach day, it doesn't feel like Pesach. That certainly is an attitude that maybe needs to be more strongly represented out there in the discussion. Again, if people still don't appreciate it after we go through all the discussion and background and context, if you still don't appreciate it, then part of what, like I said, what I want to get to is the question as to whether uh, we should be forcing people to do what they don't want to do. But the starting point here is that there was and is a group of people that do appreciate it, and the question is how much we appreciate it, or can we appreciate it more by delving into it more.
I think what you're saying is pretty much mafurish, like as a tension in the if you look in the poskim and the chuvas that talk about gebroks, like even in the Alter Rebbe's chuva, but in the famous Chacham Tzvi and others, that part of the issue is that you're ruining people's simchas yomtiv by imposing this chumrah. Like that's certainly a value or an element that the poskim are grappling with when they're discussing certain chumras.
Right. So, for example, in the Gebruk's discussion, Alter Rebbe refers at the end of Simchas Yom Tov. So, one of the points that I've emphasized in these discussions in the past is that the original Chomer of Gebruk's, as the word implies, etc., without getting too off into that, unless we want to do a little diversion there for 5 minutes. The original Chomra was in reference to crumbling the matzah into your soup, or making matzah balls, or other such dishes out of the crumbled matzah, as opposed to you go up in Chabad today, and the way they're so far beyond that. The way Gebrux, the association is that you can't let a drop of water fall on it. You have to eat the matzah out of a bag. I'm not even sure when and how these dargas in the Chomer of Gebrux arose, but the original vart was simply about not crumbling the matzah into the soup, etc. And that's what the word Gebrux actually means. It means to crumble, as we've discussed before. Um, so when the Alter Rebbe says at the end, "Simchas Yom Tov," so the vart is that took away people Simchas Yom Tov. People already had a musig in their mind of what their Pesach dishes are, what they look like, and crumbling the matzah and using that as an ingredient was an integral part of how people praved Pesach. So by introducing that chumrah, they were taking away people Simchas Yom Tov. People literally remember they just had the Knedlach 3 years ago, 2 years ago, and now I can't have it anymore. You took it away from me. Obviously, the amount of food that was available could have also been much more limited compared to the choices that we have today. So that's without the Rebbe saying, because it's Simchas Yom Tov, Achin Shal Pesach lehifsid. So on Achin Shal Pesach, the Simchas Yom Tov overcomes the Chumrah. Today in Chabad, yeah, I think at this point, I'm not sure how many people are actually looking forward to Achin Shal Pesach. Oh, now I can have my gebrekkelt whatever. It depends what you do. If you just dip them, obviously the Rebbe added the spiritual dimension to it. So there's the to just dip the matzah in the water, but that's not out Simchas Yom Tov per se. The Simchas Yom Tov was that you eat something that you enjoy, we're looking forward to, and you couldn't have otherwise. So Achin Shal Pesach, you can have your Simchas Yom Tov. And that's why we find part of that discussion is that in the early Daitas, they used to make alternatives. They would take kitniyot, they would take other kitniyos grains or false grains or whatever category they're in, and they would bake them as matzahs, and then they would crumble those and use those as a substitute. They didn't treat the kitniyos with the chumrah of gebrakts the way they treated the matzah itself. So you couldn't crumble the matzah, but you can crumble the matzah made out of grika or such ingredients. So you saw they were trying to fill in that void, that gap. How are we going to eat? We want a chremzel. We want one of these, I guess, matzah balls or whatever the machalim were that they were used to having. So they were trying to come up with substitutes so they could still have that potato starch. It seems wasn't hadn't spread yet. So it would seem that once potato starch became more widespread, then the visceral concern of the feeling restricted, feeling deprived as a result of gebrocks seems to have fallen away because now you can use potato starch. Um, Same thing goes for Pesach de Kamashka. I've made this observation before. It seems that up until somewhere in the mid 1800s, people drank mashka as their drink during the Suda, similar to the way Chazal described drinking wine during the Suda. Either whether because water wasn't a classy drink, or whether it was because there wasn't that much clean, pure water that was good for drinking, and distilling the water was considered a way of making the water less contaminated. So you knew that the water is healthier if it's if it's mashka. Adi Yemazen Chabad, you have these jokes about don't drink water, drink mashka. So you could say that these the jokes of water versus mashka goes back to this time when mashka was a safer bet perhaps than water. So today there's already this minhag. We don't have mashkan Pesach. Like I think I mentioned last time, previous time, it seems originally Rebbe Akiva Eger, who it's attributed to, was specifically referring dafka to potato mashka. So another example of potato becoming more of a central ingredient. But it seems pretty clear that people drank mashka on Pesach up until then. It was just made out of other ingredients. But then it seems that somewhere along the way between the Tzemach Tzedek and the Rebbe Rashab, it seems like perhaps the seltzer. I think bottled seltzer took off as a product maybe even before bottled water. But you start seeing seltzer being mentioned, or whatever they called it, soda water. You start seeing it being mentioned in different sources somewhere around that time as a product people drank. It comes up also when you eat meat and fish in one meal. So abal, the minhag was you drink mashke in between. Why you drink mashke in between? Because that was the drink you drank bichlal. So you weren't bichlal. Today we drink and we eat at the same time. Amal, it seems like you ate and then you paused and then you drank. So the var was you paused after the fish and you now you take a cup of mashke because that's what you drink during the meal, and then you continue. But somewhere around then, you start seeing Makaritis dimension drinking seltzer instead of, or in addition to the mashka. So the role of mashka shrank tremendously, I think, around then to more of a novelty drink. You drink it, just to say l'chaim or whatever, as opposed to the stomach. So around then is, I think, when the chumrah of, just let's not have any mashka in the house at all really kicked in. But before that, it would have been, I think, sort of unthinkable. So there are certain things that are an integral part of Pesach in a particular time or place, but at a later point, it's hard to even imagine that was the case. And in order to properly understand where things are coming from, you have to understand how that worked.
Let's go
So
into kitniyot.
right, so let's take it from the top. Kitnius is the big chumrah, the chumrah of all chumras. Um, and so often you look up the discussions of it. Clearly, it's hard to find topics on Pesach that haven't been written about extensively, and obviously Kitnius has been written about extensively. And of course, you have the modern day uh, instances, examples of Kitnius, or the contentious ones, the controversies, is Kinwa Kitnius, is it not? Um, and I remember seeing articles. I think there was a nice article in English by Rabbi Spitz, I believe the name is, where he did a nice historical, relatively speaking, historical overview and quoting the different timim and sibbis that are quoted in Paiskim. Each Paisik says a different reason. So that, it's making chakidus. Kenwa is like Kitnius, and Lufi this time and Lufi that time. That to me is actually part of the mystery. The mystery of Kitnius is when did it start? Uh, who actually is taking a chrayas for, who actually was, if it's a gzera, who was goes with the gzera. So at some point you start seeing Paiskim talking about it like it's a gzera, but what the goinim mean, I remember seeing in some book many years ago that someone even had a havamina, maybe it meant goinim in Bavel, but clearly it does not seem to have meant that. It meant goinim in Europe. So you have this mystery as to who's behind it. You have this mystery as to what the reasons are, because once Achronim start being magdir, they give different reasons. Essentially, there's something very unclear about this entire this entire concept. Another point that you realize if you look into it is that kitnius as a word actually has a specific definition. Kitnius in Chazal refers to legumes, which includes beans and a few other things. But for example, I have to go double check, but I don't think rice, rice is considered the classic example of kitnius, but I don't think rice is included in the definition of kitnius in Chazal. I believe it's in a different category. Certainly, if you use modern categories of grains, false grains, legumes, so the kitnius is all over the place in terms of what we're sweeping into this prohibition. Someone who cares about the words and the meanings and the origins of words, it kind of actually bothers me a little bit that when a word ceases to use its proper definition in a context like this. So this is kitnius, that's kitnius. You're essentially saying this is beans, that's beans. It's not beans. It's a chumrah. We're not. I'm not proposing that we change the language. Obviously, it's the halachic category of kitnius for the chumrah of Pesach, as opposed to an actual scientific label.
But yet you see that in some poskim, when they're discussing whether any particular item is included in the Xera. So sometimes they start going into the reasons of the takana and to see if that reason applies to said product. But sometimes they're like busy being medayik. The Rambam says roim kitniyos and da da da. So is this a mean under the gather of kitniyos? Which, as you said, if you were going to take that definition, you could enjoy your peanuts and your rice and many other things that we consider to be kitniyos.
Right. So I've noticed this. I haven't gone and traced to see who was the first to go to Hilchas Kalayim, because in Shulchan Aruch and Hilchas Kalayim, Simon Reish Tzadik Zayin, Yeridea, I think that's where you have the halachic definition of kitnius and this the general like, original halachic sense from Mishnayos. Um, it's interesting to it would be interesting to check when that became very commonplace or prevalent to compare it against that list, because it seems like there may have been certain things that weren't really part of the original chumrah but then got added to the chumrah later by virtue of the fact that they're on the list in Yeridea. So there are different categories, different lists, different. There's a lot of overlap and or category confusion or whatever you want to call it. But there's a lot going on that's being subsumed under this innocent word kitnius. Uh, so that's in terms of the words and in terms of so you have this question: what are the origins? What's the reason? What is the definition that we're using of what to include and not to include? There's a lot that's very unclear. I'll point out something interesting that I've observed a number of times, and I saw it again this year: sesame versus poppy. Um, again, I didn't check again to see who the first one to mention it explicitly in this context is, but it happens to be that shumshamin, I think Pragan as well, are mentioned as kitnius in Hilchos Kalayim. Interestingly, we'd have to go back and check to see whether the earliest Makritis of Kitnius do mention them or don't. But an additional wrinkle in the plot is that when Poiskim in Eastern Europe say Shumshimin, today, in the modern day, I think most of us grow up, we know Shumshimin is sesame, and the word Shumshimin and the word sesame seem to have the same linguistic origin. And Pragin or whatever, a poppy. But if you pay attention, when you're looking at the Poiskim in Eastern Europe, you'll realize that when they say shumshimen, they mean poppy. They did not have sesame in Eastern Europe. They did have poppy, and when they'll mention it in all kinds of contexts, so including for Pesach, when they were talking about the Shem and Shumshimen, they were seemingly talking about poppy and not sesame. Uh, However, later, so there was a big controversy, dafka over sesame with Rav Kook in Eretz Yisrael in was it the 1900s? I have to go double check. I think like 1909, if I'm not mistaken. Uh, uh, Rav Kook attempted to be matir shemen from sesame with certain restrictions. I think he said they wouldn't get wet in the process or whatever the vert was, and that was a flashpoint, and the more traditional community rebelled, and then that proposal sort of fell by the wayside. But there is it left a mark. There's a kuntrus Rav Kook printed at the time. So the Melamed Lahoyel was also, and he had a representative in Israel, Greenhut. So they were involved a bit. They were expressing their opinions. So the Melamed Lahoyel in his chuvas on the topic um, starts by expressing this point that there's this confusion between sesame and poppy. So in Eastern Europe, the chumrah, the ikr in this particular point was expressed more in reference to poppy, but in the East, in Eretz Yisrael, when they saw in the Sfardim that you're supposed to be machmer and shumshimin, and a lot of the Sfardim were machmer in kitnius to some extent or another. There's a sort of a misnomer that Ashkenazim observe kitnius and Sfardim don't. It's not quite like that, but it depends which min, depends which thing. But when it comes to Shem and Shumshimin, the Chida already wrote that many do use it, but some don't use it. And by the time the 1800s rolled around, it seems like the minhag Yerushalayim was not to use it. So that's the sesame. So interestingly, like I said, I don't know if the original Ashkenazim who spoke about it were even thinking of sesame, or they were talking about poppy the whole time, but it came to encompass sesame. Again, it is listed on the list of kitnius in Kalayim anyway. Um, so there is this mystery, like I said, this mystery of the origins of kitnius, the origins of this chumrah. One particular source that I recommend to people when I always recommend, I always push to have a better chronological and geographical understanding of halacha. This really extends itself to every area of halacha. Maybe we can discuss that at some greater length. It's a big nakuda, a very important nakuda. Often many sfarm today, many malachim today, uh, even if they're mitzaying to a lot of Ma'ar Mekaymis, have a lot of tziyunim, but if it's lacking that chronological and geographical understanding, so it's just a mishmash. You're Yishayim, Achreinim, often not even in the right order. They'll quote an Achrin and who said something, they'll say, and so also said so, and it's Rishon. It's
I
completely
actually,
out of order.
I won't mention it by name, but I did in recent weeks found a very, very Geschmacka Haggadah on Eitzar Chachma with tremendous amount of Makairis, but it was just so confusing to use because there didn't seem to be any awareness of hierarchies of Rishonim, Achronim, Goinim, Achroni Achronim, geography, Man Chashmei. So it wasn't useful in sort of in getting a better understanding of the development of the Haggadah, the minhagim associated with it.
Right. Once you do have a sensitivity to it, then you notice who has it, and you notice who doesn't have it, and it's yeah, you sort of almost find these types of form useless, or or if it has a list of Marmakaimis that aren't Nisman somewhere else, so then you have to pick through them and piece them together to figure out what's actually going on. By the way, if you look at earlier Sfarim, you go back far enough, the Sfarim Rishonim, they definitely had a pretty strong sensitivity to chronology and geography. And LMI, it's a self-perpetuating thing. If you're sensitive to it, then you notice who's sensitive. That includes Rishonim and early Achrayim. And if you're not sensitive, so you don't even notice that they have the sensitivity, so then you don't learn anything that you don't realize the importance. But that's it's part of a larger topic of Derech Halimud, the last few hundred years, and all that. There are larger implications here that I don't want to get into right now. But what I am saying is that I think even within our world today, the Ilma Torah today, there's definitely a ever growing sensitivity to this, and there are more and more who are writing in this fashion, whether it's articles, definitely a lot of articles like that, but also some Sfarim as well. I wanted to mention one sefer that I often mention in these contexts is a sefer minhag b'yadenu by Rabbi Dalia Oberlander. There's volumes on Moedim, volumes on Shabbos and Shayna, so there are 3 or 4 volumes. But certainly on Moedim, and for Nissen they have there's an article there on kitniyot, and I would consider it a start. I wouldn't say that it gets fully to the bottom of it in a way that's satisfactory to me, but certainly was a start. I don't know the first time that I looked at it, but definitely a bunch of years ago. It certainly starts in every topic they discuss. They will try to identify what's the first source, what's the first source that mentions it, and where were they located, and it's at least consciously stated in the presentation of things, and things are stated in that order chronologically and sorted geographically. Um, Obviously, when we identify as Ashkenaz, that's a geographic marker. And Ashkenaz has its own chronology. So, in order to understand anything in a meaningful way, you have to understand what that means. So, in terms of kitniyot, the way, if you look it up, I haven't looked at it again this year, but uh, so, perhaps surprisingly for some, I think some of the earliest Makotos or the earliest Makotos are not even necessarily from Ashkenaz. I believe there are some early Makotos Tafka from Provence, which is southern France and a little further away from Ashkenaz. No, I wouldn't. The way I would summarize it, hopefully I'm not oversimplifying things, but Serbs and Ashkenaz obviously were very closely connected. Provence is it's sandwiched between Sarfas and Sfarad, so in certain ways it has certain Sarfas influence, and in certain ways it has Sfarad influence, and in certain ways it's its own unique thing.
You get the feeling there was a lot more travel between Spain and between Sfarad and Provence than between Ashkenaz, Surface, and Provence, no?
Right? And I guess to properly understand that, you probably would have to understand the economies of the time and the travel routes of the time. And we're not going to get too off track into that. Um, but so on the one hand, it is the same general corner of Europe. On the other hand, the minhagim and the Paiskim, the Darkei Halacha were fairly different. And yet we find that there are mentions, there are attestations, and this is a kahila that also didn't pass. If you look it up, when did the Kahila in Provence end? It wasn't one abrupt end, but lasted a bit longer than Sarfas, but it had its own downturn and slowly crumbled and mostly disappeared. But up until the 17, 1800s, you had certain vincula, certain cities that were, I think, papal cities that still continued some form of minhag Provence in some form. Around the time of the Chida, you had, I think, Mordechai Carmi was a big Choshev Mechaber who lived in one of these cities at the time of the Chida. That's its own little history. But when we speak of Provence, usually we mean, I guess, through the 1300s. And so the R, I didn't look it up. I don't have the exact Marmakaimis, but I believe it does mention that there was a minhag of kidney. But again, back then, kitniyos meant literal kitniyos. It meant they meant literally beans. Probably not more, not necessarily much beyond that. But they were being nizer to not cook beans on Pesach or something like that. So we do find early Makaitis, and it's not limited to Ashkenaz per se. Again, if you want to see the exact chronology there, I would recommend looking that Sefer up. It's definitely a great resource to get you started on the path to learning things through this proper lens. But just that's just this goes to show that sometimes these labels or definitions that we have in our minds, let's say in this case it's Ashkenazi, it wasn't necessarily Ashkenazi per se. And it's also important to remember that not every minhag that arose, people have this very top-down notion of minhag that a Rav writes a minhag in a sefer, and then that becomes the minhag. But that's technically, literally, sort of the opposite of what the word minhag means and how minhag works. And this is also a major topic. But minhagim typically arise more from the bottom up. It's way a whole community does things, or the way certain special people within the community do things. And then it could take time, it could take a while till someone actually mentions it in a sefer. And they might even not originally even mention it directly as this is the minhag. They might mention it in passing, or the minhag may lead to some kind of controversy. An example of this is a topic I looked into, was it a year ago or so, selling aliyas in shul. So the very earliest mentions of selling aliyas in shul are very few and far between, but they go back very far, further than you'd expect, and they're mentioned generally because of some kind of controversy. Maybe the first knocker we have in Ashkenaz is someone was complaining that he always had the chazaka to buy it, and then other people banded together to outbid him, and he felt that they were wicked and bad for doing so, and he wrote a letter complaining, and maybe it's mentioned in Sefer Chassidim, which is a pretty early source. So you have a lot of these practices, the type of practices that are somewhere in the middle, where just because someone does it doesn't mean that anybody's writing it down. And even if someone writes it down here, it doesn't mean that people aren't doing it over there. It just means that they haven't gotten around to mentioning it or writing it down.
Yeah, I think maybe a good Pesach example of this is the minhag, whether or not it classifies as such, to have a separate pot for cooking eggs,
So
which
that is something that I just came across. I'm not the one to discover it. People have already, like I said, it's hard to find anything truly new in the area of Pesach. But I see that around the mid 1800s, the Netziv, the Eshel Avram B'Chach, the later Aruch HaShulchan, they all make reference to the fact that the women are doing this, and they all, to varying, obviously the Eshel Avram is probably the most supportive and understanding, and the Netziv is somewhere in the middle, where oh, the women ain't gvul or ain't kates the chumros, but on the other hand, it says a shmartim as a matzis. So he sort of gives a little support, a little defense that there's an Indian to go with every chumrah, and the Aruch HaShulchan I think is the most dismissive of it, and it's just it's not real, it's fake, it's made up. But really, plenty of
that parallel between the Aruch HaShulchan and the Netziv is interesting because Dafka the Aruch HaShulchan was much more closely familiar with minhagim of Chassidim than the Netziv.
right. I don't know if it was originally daf things that we think are Hasidim, and not dafka really is Hasidim. Often Hasidim just tend to document certain things more and preserve them through the many crises that befell the Eastern European communities in the last 150 years. Um, Someone just brought it up again. Rabbi Geldsaler was a Talmud of Tervadas, but being more Hasidish, he has this whole list of minhagim, going to the mikveh for men when they need to, and mitzvah times, whole list of things that today are branded as Chassidish minhagim, but he said he went and asked people and got confirmations that Amol, this was geographical. Everyone in that area did it. And at some point, certain with certain crises, whether spiritual or physical, ruptures, as the academic term is. So certain things get dropped along the way in certain communities, and other communities don't drop them, and then often it ends up being called Hasidish. There's Nittel Nacht is of course a big one. I did a thing on Nittel Nacht a few months ago, Taka, in honor of Nittel Nacht. That's an example of something which is clearly a very Ashkenaz, proper Ashkenaz back in Germany type of thing that today gets labeled Hasidic, and there are many such examples. So we have to be careful before we tag and label something Hasidic. Obviously, Gebracht, on the other hand, is taka one thing where it's very clear that Hasidim were the one. You have to go check whether anyone else mentioned any such possibility before, but certainly at the time it was Chassidim that ran with it and made it a calling card of Chassidish Haga in the nascent Chassidic movement. Um, and there were other such minhagim at the time that I've forgotten. The original Chassidim didn't would only wear silk. They wouldn't wear wool clothing. Mechasha shatnez, that was also very strongly associated. There were certain anhagas that were associated with the new Chassidic movement, um, and so Gebracht is one of them. But many other things. So you're mentioning eggs that to be chayshish, that the shells of the eggs have chametz on them. So not to put them in your Pesach pot, whatever the exact form of the chomer was. Um, so that the way that the way that Netziv and the Aruch HaShulchan are referring to it doesn't strike me as being purely Hasidic in nature. It seems like that was just something that from women in that region were doing. Uh, so yeah, these are all a lot of important. As I know we're going off onto a lot of footnotes here, but these footnotes are important in terms of having the proper context and perspective and framework for discussing these matters. So where was I?
You
Where did we get?
mentioned about kidneys originating in Provence. That's where we're.
Right. I feel like I was a bit further ahead, but okay. So I was making a point about minhagim in general. That today we often associate minhagim with, there is a musig of a gadol. A certain gadol has their personal hanhagis that then get written down, and then their talmidim, the Harochem B'darkam, want to follow those. So let's say in Chabad, we think of minhag Chabad as top-down minhagim. The Rebbe, they were noyeg, they prescribed that we can do X, Y, and Z. So that has come to dominate how we relate to the concept of a minhag, as to almost replace the more original notion. You look in Zman HaRishayim, the Zman Chazal through the Rishayim, the notion of a minhag was just a thing that people do, and that's why some minhagim could be good, some minhagim could be bad. Minhag could be Isis Gehenim. It's a thing people do, but it's not good. We disapprove. Or minhag Yisrael Tardi, if everyone does it, we're not going to question. All these statements, all these phrases are referencing minhagim that arise more spontaneously. So you could have minhagim that, for all we know, I don't know if there are any makarios from Spain, but for all we know, there could have been people in Spain who had this anhaga too. And then the question is, did someone write it? Or did no one get around to writing it? But you shouldn't just assume. Another example that I saw recently of this is Yom Kippur Katan, Erev Rosh Chodesh. So the earliest makarios we have for fasting are from Ashkenaz. But then the big burst in popularity came from the exiles from Spain who came to Tzfas. That's where it really took off. But the fact that it took off in Tzfas among the people from Spain suggests that the roots could have been there from before. Maybe just no one ever mentioned in Spain that this was a thing. It's very possible for things to be practiced and not be written down. I think if you start thinking about it in those terms, you realize that there are plenty of things that people do today that we don't necessarily attach spiritual significance to, or even if it's chumras, or is every funny chumrah that everyone has for Pesach, is it written down in a sefer somewhere, or until someone actually gets around to writing it. So you really have to think about it that way, where it seems like the true answer, the true solution, the true explanation for kitniyot is that it seems to have risen spontaneously in that general area, which may reach as far as Spain. And people had this sensitivity. Also, you have to remember, very important thing you have to remember and understand, is that up until 200 years ago, people brought actual sacks of wheat or flour into their house for Pesach. I saw there was a discussion online about mois chitin versus kimcha de pischa, which also seems to break down geographically. I didn't have a chance to do my own research on that to see whether searching Sfarim can give us an indication as to what the geography of these terms is. But and there were those who pointed out that perhaps it actually indicates a different tanhaga, where perhaps in certain regions they gave out flour, and in certain regions they gave out chitin. Possible, I don't know. It's certainly a thesis that's worthy of being tested and checked. Uh, but you open Shulchan Aruch. One of the things I was looking into this year. You open Shulchan Aruch, and there's discussions of you have a sack of wheat, and it's next to a wall, and there's condensation from the wall, and now the sack has this condensation on it. What's the story? Do you treat it as water? Do you treat it as mei Paris? Interesting question. What happens if there's a wet lump inside the sack? What do you do? So going back to the Rishonim and Ashkenaz, there's a big discussion about how you have to put it through the sifter, so that way hopefully the clumps will get caught in the sifter, and then you can keep the rest. What if it's really really old, and once something that got wet gets really old, then it starts crumbling itself, so then the sifting won't work anymore. It's not a good solution anymore. But they're talking about actual sacks of wheat. I saw that the Shkari Knesset Hagdala in I believe in Saloniki is very angry that other Meir Hiros were being makel in these wet clumps in the sacks, and he's being more machmer. Uh, it's very, very sharp, and the other Rabbanim and Saloniki after him had to sort of be malam etzchos and to defend for why we're not paskening like him. So even Alter Rebbe and the chuvas of the Alter Rebbe, there's definitely something there about a sack that got wet. I saw even later, a few generations later, obviously sacks of wheat always exist. The question is whether we're interacting with them or not. All the matzah bakeries are clearly bringing sacks of wheat from somewhere to somewhere. It's completely invisible to us, and you have no idea whether those sacks might get wet in some form, and then what they have to do about it. It's just been completely shifted to an invisible place where we don't have to think about it, and kids don't have to understand where the bread or the matzah on their table comes from. It just comes from the store, or comes from the bakery. But obviously, until 150 years ago, people were quite aware as to where their matzahs came from. It came from flour, which came from wheat, and they had sacks of wheat. So you have to think about people before Pesach bake their own matzah. And I think if you look in the Makaitis about the Shem Matzah's mitzvah, part of the emphasis was that you weren't doing something that was that much different than how you bake bread all the time. So you had to keep that at the top of your mind. The Shem Matzah's mitzvah. What I'm doing now is different than what I usually do. Otherwise, if I just zone out and I space out, as the phrase goes, then you're not being mishamer the matzah from becoming chametz. You have to have that conscious awareness. Whereas today, if you're in the matzah bakery, everything about what you're doing is already sort of automatically different, completely radically different than the usual process. First of all, no one really bakes bread that way at all, etc. So people were interacting with the grain, they were interacting with the wheat, and then let's say they had a sack of wheat and they had a sack of beans. So the associations you would make are completely different than the associations you would have today. Today, you buy a pound or 2 pounds of flour, and that's flour, and you buy a small bag of challah beans, and you don't really, you certainly don't watch them grow. You certainly have no real notion as to how similar or different they are in terms of how they're grown and how they're collected and how they're stored. So lacking that knowledge, if you lack that knowledge, then you're already not really in a position to understand or appreciate what the chumrah may or may not be. You may argue, to jump ahead here a little bit, you may argue that for that reason, maybe these chumras are no longer so relevant. Okay, I could hear that. But let's at least first start by understanding and appreciating what they meant, what they represented when they started, when they originated. So it seems like in that time and that place, there was something just very natural, very intuitive about saying, you know what, Pesach with very nizer, let's keep beans out of the house. That just seems like it was not an overly controversial, out of the left field type of notion of thought. And for that reason, it seems to have arisen spontaneously, although it's hard to document that stage, that phase. But that means that at any given point, some people were being nizer, but other people were probably not being nizer. There was no consistent means, by there's no way to measure or way to know how many people were observing this. And that brings me to a source that I came across this year, or re-examined, and have a better appreciation of. So one of the big makaris for minhag Ashkenaz, and that sort of codified what it means to have Ashkenaz minhagim, are these sifrei minhagim from Ashkenaz from the 1400s. So the most famous one of those is the Sefer Maharil. Maharil is Rabbi Yaakov Segel, Rabbi Yaakov Molin. Um, I have to go check his biography again. Back then, there were two regions of Ashkenaz. There was Rhinus versus Österreich. So he's more associated with Rhinus, but he did spend time in Österreich as well. But he's famous for being in Vermeiza, which was the old one of the oldest, most hashivst cities in Ashkenaz. Throughout his svarim, he'll talk about minhag Vermeiza, minhag Magenza. Magenza is one of the other hashivst such cities. And even then, there were slight minhagim, slight differences in minhagim between the two. So Maril himself did not actually write the Sefer Minhag Maril. Maril had a Talmud, Reb Zalman. Reb Zalman was his Shem Choyel. His Shem Kodesh was, I think, Elazar or Eliezer, but he's known as Reb Zalman. And this Talmud wrote down the Anhagas of his Rebbe. And this is something that he was not. This was a trend in Ashkenaz at the time. So another somewhat famous one today is the Lekad Yosher, which is the Talmud of the Trumas Hadeshen. So the Trumas Hadeshen wrote other chiburim and wrote a lot, but this Talmud of the Trumas Hadeshen wrote down all these anhagas and even minor details that the Trumas Hadeshen himself may not have written anywhere.
Am I
Um,
am I right that Trumas Hadeshen is not Ashkenaz? He's Österreich.
well, it's still under the umbrella of Ashkenaz, but yeah, Trumas Hadeshen is
He's not
Österreich.
the Rhineland. He's
And in fact, I was just looking into this yesterday. Tes Nissen, Kuf Pei Aleph, was the date of the end of the Gzeras Vin, the Gzeras Vienna, on which the duke or the king of that region had captured all the Jews and tortured them for close to a year, and then whoever hadn't converted or escaped was burned at the stake. Tes Nissen Kuf Pei Aleph, and the Trumas Hadeshen lost his mother and his uncle in that. So it's living in Österreich. It's not just there was some serious history, some serious trauma, if you want to use modern day terms. Like Yosher writes that the Trumas Hadeshen would fast on Tes Nissen, even though it's a Nissen, but it was his yard. He had a yard site, so he used to fast on Tes Nissen, on his yard site. Trumas Hadeshen has shuvas about people who converted, women who converted, and then they returned. Are they mutter to their husbands or usher to their husbands? These were the types of shilas that to deal with. And in the context there, he mentions it all. We had this type of shilah taka back, test this and Kuf Aleph. We had these types of shilas with some of the survivors of that parsha. So yeah, very firmly in Österreich, Vienna, and that's the history there for the Trumas Hadeshen. So Trumas Hadeshen's Talmud Lekad Yosher wrote this chibur. Now the Sefer Maril and the Sefer Lekad Yosher's fates diverge completely. Sefer Maril became very famous, very influential, was printed at a pretty early date. It's quoted by the Ramah. It's quoted by all the poskim. It's been influential essentially nonstop since then. Sefer Lekad Yosher was written by this Talmud, and then no one saw it until whatever 150 years ago. Someone found it Saviad and printed it, and today it is quoted a lot, but it certainly it's playing catch up. It certainly doesn't have the same status as the Sefer Minhag Ma'aril. So Sefer Minhag Ma'aril has a section Cholos HaAsudis BePesach, which for some reason I find somewhat amusing, just in the actual term that I think. I'm pretty sure it was introduced in Minhag Ma'aril for the first time. That there's a whole category of Cholos HaAsudis BePesach. Mela. Obviously in the Rambam you have machalos that are aser tzad the din Torah, but when you say machalos that are aser on Pesach, it's already coming from this Ashkenaz type framework. So the Maharil there has a passage. The Sefer Maharil has a passage. But before I get to that, I want to point out that what the chiddush for me in particular this year is that there's actually another step, another piece of the chain that really needs to be called out and identified separately. And that is that before you get to the Maharil, there is Reb Shalom of Neustadt. Now, when we say Neustadt, it's also a city in Austria, Wiener Neustadt. And Uh, the Maharil himself, I think I just mentioned, did spend some time in Austria, and he was apparently a Talmud of this Reb Shalom of Neustadt. Reb Shalom of Neustadt also had a Talmud who also wrote down his Rebbe's Hanhagas and things his Rebbe said. Um, this is like a memutza. It's not quite the Sefer Maharil. It's not quite Lekad Yosher. Um, I think Mechon Yerushalayim printed it a few decades ago. They found the Ksav Yad maybe in Russia. But as they point out, the Taisus Yamtif and others a few generations later did have either this manuscript or another copy of this manuscript. It was somewhat known, at least back then, and then it sort of faded into obscurity. The Sefer Maharil sort of cannibalized the market. But when they found this Ksav Yad, they realized, and it was pointed out, how important it is as a source. So it was printed. So now we have the Sefer Minhag Maharil. Now, if you look through the Sefer Minhag Maharash, Maharash being Reb Shalom of Neustadt. Now, when you look through the Sefer Minhag Maharil, what you'll find is that there actually are many passages that begin Omar Maharash, and it's referring to this Reb Shalom of Neustadt. Now, people who are mitzayin to those passages will say the Maharil said that Reb Shalom of Neustadt said X, Y, and Z. So it ends up being attributed to the Maharil. This is somewhat problematic, and maybe again it gets into what does kitniyot actually mean, or getting things exactly right. But having looked into this, this bothers me because if you actually read the first of all, Maharil didn't write Minhag Maharil, so at any rate, you should be saying that Reb Zalman, the Talmud of Maharil. But in addition to that, if you read the Hakdama of Reb Zalman to the Sefer Minhag Maharil, which I can't say I had read or most people probably don't read, he actually writes very explicitly that he had a copy of this Ksav Yad of the Minhag Maharash, of Minhag Reb Shalom Neishta. And he writes the name of the person who wrote it. His Hebrew name was Reb Yosef, his Yiddish name was Reb Yuspa, Reb Yuzap, however you want to pronounce it. Um, so he writes that he had this chibur of a Talmud, of a chashav, a Talmud of Reb Shalom, and he says that where I went through this chibur, I'm already putting together all the minhagim and all these halachic topics, and I had this chibur of Marash. So I figured, you know what? Wherever there's a relevant passage in the Sefer Marash, I'll copy it into my Sefer, so you'll have all the information in my Sefer. So that means that everywhere it says in Sefer Maharil, Amar Maharash, that's actually the Maharil is not part of that transmission at all. He learned from Reb Shalom. It could be he acted on the basis of those minhagim of Reb Shalom, but all those passages that are in Maharil are actually not Maharil. They are Reb Shalom via his Talmud Reb Yosef, who wrote it down, via Reb Zalman, the Talmud of Maharil, who copied it into his chibur. And that's probably another reason why Minhag Marash sort of fell by the wayside, because Reb Zalman strategically had absorbed it into his sefer. So his sefer had not just the things Maharil said, but it had many of the things that Reb Shalom had said before. He says, look, it's a chashav Talmud. He was my Rebbe's Rebbe, so I don't see why I shouldn't copy it in.
So the Sefer
Um,
Minhagei Maharash that you mentioned was printed by Mechon Yerushalayim. That, for the most part, is all already included in Minhagei Maharil, in the Sefer
you would
Minhagei
have,
Maharil.
you would have to check the Mava or check through the Sefer specifically to see what percentage. It's not 100% of it. It's definitely not 100% of it, but a certain percentage. Sometimes you'll see that the Lashon is pretty close, come out ice by ice, and that again reinforces the fact that that the Reb Zalman is simply copying it from the source. But sometimes he'll edit it, he'll omit details. One interesting thing I was looking at is certain names that the author of Sefer Menhagim Marash says. I asked my Rebbe Marash on behalf of Mrs. Shandel. She seems to have been an important woman who had her hand in a lot of businesses, and she kept on having interesting shilas. And it seems like she would have this Talmud go and ask questions on her behalf. So he'll write, in a number of cases, he'll write Sha'alti Machmas Maras Shandel or Shandlin. Some of those, I think not all of them, but some of them are copied into Mariel, and of those that are, that those details are omitted, so you won't see the full. It will say, Marash Akapaskin for someone. It will omit the specific details. So certainly, the original Sefer Menag Marash certainly has a lot to add, even for the passages in the Maril. If you want to better understand those passages in the Maril, the Shem Maharash, you definitely gain from comparing it to how it appears in the Sefer Menag Marash. There's certain phrases that maybe in the Makar weren't so clear, and the author of Sefer Maril fix them up, but maybe you want to see how it's said originally, etc. So there definitely are gaps and differences, etc. Um, so this is passage that's in minhag marash, and from there copied into minhag maril about kitniyot specifically. Very, very, very sharp, very sharp. Uh, where essentially Marash, Reb Shalom Neishtat said that kitniyot is Gzeira. The Chachamim were, he almost speaks as if like it's Chazal. The Chachamim Rabbanon were geyser it, and therefore it's like saucer. Say kitniyot is not for me. And he says, even if you're going to come and tell me that I have a minhag, my minhag is, again, minhag in the sense of this is what we do. In my house or in my community or my block, we're not nizer and kitniyos. He says, even if you're going to say that it's a minhag, it's not a minhag, it's a minhag shtos, or whatever term he uses to counterbalance the force of the power of minhag. It's not a minhag. Who told you that you could do it? You claim a chacham told you that you could do it. Now, if that chacham was here, if we could ask him, it would be clear that you misunderstood. Fake news, as they say. So you have this very strong, emphatic language, which I think is the first of its kind to that extent. That's expressed by Reb Shalom and copied into Maril, and from there, very influential on the topic. So what we see is that even as late as the 1400s, it would seem like, or the late 1300s, it seems like not everyone, even in Ashkenaz, was necessarily keeping kitniyos. But at this point, it had spread so much and become such a given to the Rabbanim, to the Chacham, to the Gedolim, that they put their foot down and they said this is binding for everyone, and no one has the option to object, to say my minhag is different. And that's why ever since then, kitniyos has been sort of this non-negotiable thing in Ashkenaz. Obviously, if you start going through the tshuvas, you'll see there's cases at the edges, or certain minim, or shem and shum shemen is an example of where there was maybe more room for minhag lekula. If you look at the Tzemach Tzedek, and I think it's Isaac of Vitebsk, I think, who were discussing shem and shum shemen, which again was probably Poppy in their case. They talk about the shemen that they did use, and it seems like the different shmanim that they may have been using, at least the dalas ha'am, the poorer people, maybe the less mahadir, the less machmer, they were using oil that came from minim that are technically on the kitniyos list in Yeridea. So there's definitely stuff at the edges. As we said, kitniyos kept on expanding to include more categories. So what exactly kitniyos means or how far you're applying it can still vary somewhat. Now today you can argue over quinoa and whether you treat quinoa like kitniyos, but so somewhere at this point, someone put their foot down and drew the line and said that at this point we treat it like it's a binding minhag for everyone. And again, like I said, it's not just Ashkenazim. Certainly, Sephardim in the East kept chumros of kitniyos to differing extents. You have to go check each kehillah and to what extent and what their poskim say. But it's not just a random thing, like a random mishagas that got stuck in Ashkenaz. It definitely had a much larger, more meaningful context. And then at some point in Ashkenaz, in particular, who were very into documenting minhagim and codifying them. So this was established. This is a minhag. At this point, they're not even treating it like a minhag. They're not calling it a minhag. They're calling it a gzeira. It has Zera-like levels of the degree to which it's binding is so powerful that it's not negotiable anymore, and that's essentially anyone who identifies as Ashkenazi, although what that identity means can also be discussed to some extent. But there are some people today, not within the very Haredi black hat world, there are some people beyond that who perhaps could, plausibly identify as post-Ashkenazi, and obviously to some extent the Medina, the establishment of the State of Israel, created the possibility in some minds. I think Rav Kook, for example, to whatever extent, and others in those circles, it created this possibility of, can we create a post-Ashkenaz, post-breakdown of European modes of practice, European minhagim? Can we do something like that? And obviously, a big chunk of the from observant world has, I guess, rejected that possibility. But I see I'm not going to dismiss it as complete nonsense. It's obviously not something that we accept as a valid possibility, but it's something that at least some people have considered, have thought about, have entertained as a possibility. So that's the story in Kitnius in a, can I say, nutshell? Do I have to say pun intended, pun not intended? But that's, for example, the case of Kitnius. What's interesting is that many of the other chumras that we have are not actually that much later than Kitnius itself, or maybe just a bit later, maybe 100, 200 years later. So, for example, one thing people grew up hearing about is schmaltz. At this point, I don't know what percentage, even of Black Hat, even of Hasidish Chabad, I'm not sure what percentage are actually being makbid to only use schmaltz for frying, etc., as opposed to any oil. I feel like the market share, the share of the food community has shrunk. I don't know what the numbers are. Um, Also, even within Chabad, it's hard to generalize. Maybe this is a point I wanted to get to, of people identify as Chabad, but to what extent does that identification carry? What percentage of these minhagim are being observed? Especially with Pesach dik minhagim, where not all of these minhagim were necessarily written in a formal binding work such as Sefer minhagim, as opposed to this is what the Rebbeim do, or this is what your parents and your grandparents did. Chabad obviously is more diverse at this point than people that have parents or grandparents that did things a certain way. Although I think even among those that did have parents or grandparents, there certainly are chunks of people that also just feel frustrated and want to move on from that. Uh, so take an example of schmaltz. Growing up, you sort of, I don't know, my grandmother would buy schmaltz or make schmaltz, but she wasn't. I don't think she was using it exclusively. I think it was just part of the color of the Yom Tif that Pesach comes around. Oh, let's get our schmaltz and let's also use the schmaltz. Like I said, some houses, I think certainly whatever the small percentage is, I imagine are still being makbid to only use schmaltz. Um, but what's the mucker? So if you actually take a look, you look and say from minhag Mario, uh, he actually doesn't formally state it as like a form. He doesn't prescribe it as a minhag. But if you look at his discussions of what you use for Pesach, it's pretty clear from the language there that essentially they only used schmaltz for Pesach, and part of that has to do with the history of oil and the oils that were available at different times in Europe. Obviously, in the last 150 years or so, there's been an explosion of the possibilities of sources that you can source oil from. Today, you can squeeze oil out of just about anything. But the further you go back, the fewer the options were. And it seems pretty clear that a lot of the early options for oil were considered to be kitniyot derived. So kitniyot is a strongly related issue here. Um, and it's pretty clear from the Maharil that he's talking. He's like not directly making that point. He's making additional points as to, okay, so if you're going to use a schmaltz, you have to make sure that it's not in a chametz tekekeli, things like that. He mentions, some people use shemen agoizim, they use nut oil, but also you have to make sure you're not using chametz tekekeli. Back then, people didn't have sets of pesach tekekeli. So it was trickier. Maybe you kashered the plates, but maybe not the machine that you used to make the oil. So you had to. There was there were a lot of concerns as to what the kale. Just like today, if you're using a factory and you're not replacing you don't have a pesach like a factory. You have to kasher the factory, and the more complex machines become, the more that could be a concern. The big tshuva that Tzemach Tzedek about mashka and Pesach actually had to do with a factory, like an early somewhat modern factory that was new to Russia and Ukraine, and it was hard to kasher it properly, and that was the issue there, as opposed to the actual mashka itself. Uh, that's the context there in the Maharil. But the Maharil is sort of acknowledging this fact that you can't use the regular oils, and it's either going to be schmaltz or it's going to be nut oil. Olives, this sometimes comes up in the discussions about kazayas. Did they have for the Rishonim in Europe? Do they have the zayas? Do they have zayis? Do they not? So I don't know if we can completely generalize. Maybe sometimes in some places they did have olive oil. Maybe they had the oil, but not the olives. I don't know 100%. So whether or not they had olives or they didn't, they had olive oil. It doesn't think they had that much that often. Um, So there are people who have written about this. Last year, I came across someone in Satmar who was trying to explain or bring back the old Satmar Hanhaga Akpada to use schmaltz as opposed to other oils. And what tends to happen in these cases is if you want to make your case, if you want to prove your point, then you need to do this. You need to go back as far as possible and explain and trace, how far back this goes, or is it just a mishigas that my Zayda had, or is this something that Gans Ashkenaz has been doing for 500-600 years? Surely, if you appreciate that context, that should shape your attitude towards it. So someone in Saturn wrote about it, and went this far back. I saw this year someone in Bells. There's a kaivetz that's published by Bells in Eretz Yisrael called Hatzafon, I believe. Eitzer Chachma has them. And I guess with every update, you get a few more issues of the kaivetz. So there's someone by the name of Rabbi Jakob, who's doesn't sound such a Belgian name, sounds a bit more Hungarian, but someone who's a dayan and a Moed Tzedek for Belz and Ashdod. And he actually, I've started noticing, he actually writes some very, very nice articles for this kaivetz on Inyane Halacha and Minhag, particularly Inyane Minhag. And he'll take stuff that you think, it's Chassidish Minhag, and he'll take you. He goes all the way back, and he goes very thoroughly, very nicely through the earliest Makaitis and really lays it out very nicely. Again, I would say these types of works are still lacking a certain historical dimension, so they'll still just sort of quote these Makaitis as so and so said this and so and so said that, and there's five shittas, and as opposed to I still look for a bit of a narrative beyond that, but short of that, it is very, very good. So I saw that he also a few years ago wrote about oils and schmaltz on Pesach. Um, and the fact is that there is a very long paper trail of discussions about this. One of the sources that's quoted is Noda Yehuda. Noda Yehuda, especially based on recent scholarship, we know is not someone who just necessarily, Sefer Chassidim, non-Talmudic Makairis, he didn't necessarily respect so much, but he writes with regard to oil that even Shemin Zayas, even though there should be nothing wrong with Shemin Zayas, it's not kitniyot. However, I, I've never seen anyone use Shemin Zayas. He said something to that effect. We'd have to look up the exact context to see if he's 100% signing his name, putting his name to that. But it seems like he says something to the effect of, we don't, it's not something that we use, it's not something that we've seen people using. And that's often one of the ingredients for the hummus and haggis and Pesach is partially there's an original reason, a chumrah concern, but then even if you have ways around that concern, but if it's not something that we've done, if that's not how we did it, so if that's something that you care about, it's something that you appreciate, and you understand the context, then that's a svara that was often invoked and is still invoked by many to say, let's continue doing things the way our Zaydas did it. I think to some extent it's, our Zaydas, the way it's seen from a Chassidish perspective, I think to some extent is that we're not just making it up. We're not just practicing our own Judaism the way we want to do it. I mean, we're walking through a Durch getratene Weg. Our ancestors, our Rebbes, they, uh, they trotted out a path of how to do things. And I think I've seen the Chassidish Mekaidas, they davened. They daven that if you do it this way, there shouldn't be a mixture, there shouldn't be, no chametz should be involved. But if you bring new products in, then who daven for that? Who's taking achrayas? Who's taking spiritual achrayas that there shouldn't be chametz in these things? So I'm not saying that's a svara that appeals to everyone, but if you're already in the market and uh, you're interested and it does speak to you, so this is a way of crystallizing. I don't know if you have to take these phrases literally, or everyone could take them as literally as they want, but it expresses a certain sentiment of walking on the path that's been well trodden. Uh,
I was
so
just I was just thinking, you mentioned earlier, but I was thinking that Lamaisa, we uphold the minhag Ashkenaz to use chrein for morer in addition to lettuce, with all the halachic complications in that shitta, which not for now. But I was thinking like a part of the it's baked into our seder the way we do it. That even though halacha al pi halacha, there's a lot to question about it, but Lamaisa, we're upholding the minhag Ashkenaz to use chrein.
right, right. there's even a subplot in minhag Ashkenaz or minhag Poland, which is to use zerzach. The question is what zerzach is, but apparently it's
The Alter Rebbe says in Shulchan Aruch that chasa, what's it called again in the Chazaris, is not zerzach.
not zerzach, right? So you look in the Neisa Kalim, someone brought it up again, and then I was looking through this Rabbi Yaakov's stuff, and I saw that he wrote something on that as well. Um, so zerzach is this Polish word, and it refers to a plant from the cress family, the bitter cress, or something like that. So someone in Poland in the early Neisa Kalim mentioned it as mar, and then there was immediate pushback. I actually saw that one of the, I don't remember if it was Lavosh or someone from that circle said, my Zayda told me that he checked the scientific books, I call it the Sefer HaRefuos, the medical books, the books that would tell you about the species. And they checked, and Zerzach is definitely not from that family of lettuce or uh, whatever plant it's supposed to be. It's interesting to see that type of source of knowledge be invoked even in that context by the early Nisakim in Poland.
I don't
Uh,
know how often the Alter Rebbe quotes Sifrei HaRefuos in Shulchan Aruch, but this is one place where he does. Right before where he says it's not zerzach, he says that it's in Spanish and in all the languages it's called salat, and then he
Lot,
says of a Sifrei HaRefuos. You remember this?
remind
Um,
me.
I'll find it here in a second. Of a Sifrei HaRefuos, he gives you the, I guess, what's the scientific name for romaine lettuce. Of a Sifrei HaRefuos nikra latiga salat. It's in
Right.
Tamayin Gimel Sif Chavzan in Alter Rebbe.
Right, and these are all different variations. Latich, latiga, these are all different variations of the word lettuce. They all come from the same shadish. Right, and the word salat obviously is salad. Yeah. Um, Right, so Sifrei Refuos, right? It would be interesting to trace where that phrase entered Alter Rebbe from. But it seems like in this context, even the Gedolei Noisa Kalim Achreinim resorted to looking into Sifrei Refuos to just get the species straight. And it's hard to observe halacha without having your species straight. Obviously, certain species are more clear and obvious if you live in the Middle East versus if you live in Eastern Europe. So if you live in Eastern Europe or beyond, or today, no matter where you live, you could just be oblivious to where anything grows or how anything grows or what any min anything is. So there's also an important idea you need in order to. I sort of say this even the gabe and esrig. If you don't, if you live in such an isolate, we live in such isolation from nature and from how things grow, which is completely ahistorical. It's not how anyone lived until very recently. Uh, but if you don't know that an esrig is a citrus fruit, and that I can't give you exact hagdara halachically speaking, but if I think it's possible for a child or even some adults to be so disconnected from the world of agriculture that you don't even your attitude towards the esrog isn't fully properly that it's a fruit that grows on a tree that you can eat and that it's related to this fruit and to that fruit. And I think originally the mitzvah was you're supposed to take the fruit off the tree that grows down the block, and you bring this fruit. Without getting into my shit, this I'm not going to go all the way down that rabbit hole right now. But for other things as well, matzah, like I alluded to before, if you don't fully understand that wheat grows in the field and you grind it and you get flour and you make matzah, I think you're lacking. Again, is there a clear halachic hagdara? I don't know, but you're sort of lacking part of what matzah is. Even meat, you don't understand that it comes from an animal, and that's a common one. Americans don't chop. Even some maybe slightly less intelligent ones, they grow up and they don't chop that the meat is that the meat that they're eating is from a cow. Or another one I've seen recently is about apples. And some people have apple trees, but they're convinced that those are tree apples. Those aren't the apples that we eat. The apples that we eat come from the store. Those are tree apples. They're not edible. Just a very weird, random thing that apparently a significant number of people seem to believe. Uh, so there's this tremendous disconnect, even if you do have some plants in your backyard. So I think it's integral to performing many mitzvahs that involve such food products. It's certainly very negate to Havana.
In the Lashon Rambam, the mitzvah is livdik b'simanei chayiv oif dogim whatever. Yeah.
Right. So today we're yard to that by arguing about the what's the name of the chicken that was the big controversy,
Oracle.
the brackle chicken, right? So in the Hakdama, when you start writing about the brackle chicken, you say, oh, there's like a mitzvah, livdik, b'simane. And then when these controversies come up, all of a sudden you see all the rabbanim, they're running to these books, or they're running to professors in their fields, and everyone looks for Makaitis to bolster their position. But ideally, if you want to be kind of the mitzvah, certainly if you want to engage in halachic discussion, it's just an integral part of Havana is Havana Samatzias, and unfortunately, in some quarters or some circles or some people at least seem to think that you can skip that part and just get to the lumdus when in my opinion, certainly there is no lumdus without the underlying mitzias, and underlying mitzias is to be somewhat broad in scope of understanding the full context of how things grow and right that's like back to kitniyot, how they grew and how they were used and how they were treated and how they were prepared was a big part of the uh, discussion and the motivation behind the practice.
So
So
let's
back
get to schmaltz and oil.
right. Um, so anyways, back to schmaltz. So in this day and age, certainly there are many other means of producing oil that would seemingly be nowhere near the territory of kitniyot at all. So that's the question. So you have this person in Satmar seemed to be saying that up until they came to America, they were Makban and Schmaltz, but then at some early point, someone, people went into business, they opened factories, they opened product lines, and I guess someone came along and said, "Hey, we'll get a good hechsher, and we'll make sure that it's all al taras hakodesh, and there's no chash chametz." And then that somehow, obviously, bichlal, once population grows and once the population isn't producing their own food, and things are made on an industrial scale, so then many industrial products sort of become the more obvious option. And that gets into a larger question of the Shailam Pesach of homemade versus industrial. Often the Hechsherim, those that are involved in that line of work, will say that you know potentially doing it on an industrial scale could be less of a chashash chametz. I remember there was a line from one of the Hechsherim that the orange juice from our Hechsher has less of a chashash chametz than the thing you sat and squeezed out of Pesach or whatever in your house. Um, I think it's possible. It's possibly true in some cases. First of all, there's no transparency. It's not like I've said long ago that I think at this point with the technology we have for the blockchain, etc. Technically, every product that we get could have something you could scan where you could see where all the ingredients were sourced from and every step along the way, and which hechsherim took achrayas for each ingredient, and which mashgiach, which person, which yid, nemanus is on the line, right? So that's how things more or less. Obviously, back in the day, how many things would be imported and would have less of a sense of who was behind it. Most food didn't travel that far. Even today, you have the movement of people that use that language, not in a Jewish context at all, but using this language of locally sourced. Are these for some they're just buzzwords, or for some they actually mean something? Um, Locally grown, locally sourced. When that's the case, so then you have a relationship with the person that sold it, or you're one or two steps away from the source, and it's interesting to see that this notion has an art, has a place, exists even beyond the halachic context. Um, I've made the argument. One of my I'm throwing in all my Pesach Torahs here. I'm making one package deal, but one of my Pesach Torahs, one of my retlach for Pesach is that people ask what's this vart of not being makbid on commercial. And I say that I think the way halacha is structured, the way Torah is structured, is the assumption was that uh, you grow your food directly, or you know who you got it from, or food is prepared somewhat. They didn't have complex recipes, but if food is prepared somewhat, so you know whose namanas you're relying on. There's a personal trust there between you and the person who made it, who gave it to you, who sold it to you. Whereas today, obviously the Aksharim are telling you that they're doing an amazing job, and there are no concerns or no chashashas. We know for a fact that chashashas do arise, concerns do arise. Hefsed Meruba is something that gets invoked. You're just not going. It's not going to. There's no QR code that you can scan that's going to tell you Hefsed Meruba was used in the process of bringing this food to your table. But there's no reason to think that it's not being invoked. Sometimes there's just no paper trail that's being shared with us. And then sometimes certain scandals do do break out of out of containment, and we sort of hear about them. And there are some famous cases in hopefully more the distant history than recent history. But obviously, Hakshirim have had their bad days, their bad cases, things where they completely failed, or things where they had to mamish be mekel b'daichik. um, so my taina is that on Pesach, in many ways and in many areas, we do things in a lechatchiladik way, the way things were originally intended. So I think this idea of doing things yourself as much as possible is more in line with how things were originally intended, and then it's your chayas. So yeah, could be you're not doing as great a job as a robot in a completely sanitized factory, but it's you put in the effort, you take the achrayas, or your family member does, or if it's something that you have to, let's say you don't make your own wine, but your neighbor makes the wine. If you buy homemade wine, so your neighbor who you trust, is a Yerei that your neighbor made the wine. Maybe you came in and were a little bit. um, this gets back to mentioning the matzah bakery and how matzahs are prepared. Again, we live in a time and a place where it's impossible for everyone to be making everything for themselves. There's obviously always going to be room for factories, and it's very necessary. And even for those who don't use matzahs, factory matzahs, but the amount of Jews out there that do use it, there isn't enough hand baked matzah that's actually, I don't think that exists, actually could supply every single Jew out there who wants to eat matzah or Pesach, etc. Um, so ever since around the time that factories came into being, it was around the time that the population was exploding, and the amount of Jews that are only nominally observant. All three things happen around the same time, and so there are always going to be people that need or want these products. So not
If,
not way,
if I
but
could if I could steer the conversation back to schmaltz a second, I
yeah.
think that schmaltz is to summarize what you said is basically that the minhag to use schmaltz was the Yisoida minhag to avoid shem and kitniyos, which may be included to avoid all shem and mechshash shem and kitniyos. I guess in that particular, so the question is, okay, to what extent do you uphold a minhag that no longer has any quote unquote relevant reason more than just upholding the minhag? I think specifically with schmaltz, the back the backlash that you often hear, besides health concerns, whatever, but the backlash that you often hear is that al kapanim nowadays, that schmaltz that you buy, certainly if you buy, commercially produced shchita and schmaltz and all of that, that there's taka more of a chashash of actually having grains from the chicken food or whatever mixed into it, than oil that is manufactured, either people who make homemade oil or even if you buy oil, but oil that's made as you described in a sanitized factory. So it's kind of more. It's not just a question of do you uphold the minhag of using schmaltz or not, but here upholding that minhag has its own possible drawbacks. Versus, I mean, I guess you could say don't use schmaltz or oil, but if you want to use something, if you're making a choice and you're not saying else I'm preserving my family's minhag, well, you're going to make a choice. Am I going to use schmaltz or am I going to use oil? So now there's already it's not just a level playing field of do I uphold the minhag or do I not uphold the minhag.
Yeah, technically that's a concern. Again, back to this point about how your schmaltz is made, how your oil is made. Someone I know posted online a year or two ago that they got a nuts crushing machine, a machine that converts nuts into oil, and they were going with shemen agayzim. Shemen agayzim was also mentioned very early on in the Maril. So you can get the nuts yourself, and you can crush the nuts, and I'm sure it's somewhat expensive and somewhat giving yourself extra work and extra effort, but that is something that you could do, and that would still be in line with the general original minute. Obviously, yeah, schmaltz. The fact anything that's being handed back, obviously schmaltz amol meant that you brought the behemoth to the sheichet, or the sheichet shechted the behemoth in front of you, or a day before, and you brought the meat home and you processed it yourself. The technically the details of how it was prepared or what it was fed could be controlled. You could have your say, you could have your input. Um, I just saw what did I just see? I just saw a discussion. I just saw a discussion recently about how there's a totally forgotten chumrah that was huge in the 17, 1800s, which was not to drink milk on Pesach. And the reason why you didn't drink milk on Pesach was because the chickens were fed chametz, and the shaila was whether it's haste that the milk is chametz for
The
that
cows,
reason.
not the chickens. Yeah, the cows.
Like, I'm sorry. Why? Yeah, no, I'm confusing. Right, of course. That's yeah. The cows were. You also had shalas about chickens, and if the chickens ate chametz right up until Pesach and you shechted them, that would be the version of that shaila for the chicken. But yeah, sorry for the crossed wires there. The cows were eating chametz, and then the milk. Uh, was then the Shiloh was kol many polim zev goyim, these types of hagdaras terminology. It was a huge deal in the 1800s, and everyone still staked out positions. The Tshuva Me'ava, Lezer Fleckles writes that someone wrote to him asking, "What, you Taka don't drink milk?" He said, "Yeah, Taka don't drink milk." Like chassid ani, and he doesn't mean chassid even in the Hasidic movement, but in the older term, which I wanted to get to, I don't know if we'll get to. Um, I'm not looking for extra things to do, but when I was young, the Reb David Oppenheim announced in Shul, you can't drink milk. So I was like, you can't drink milk. That was the psak. So there was this, like I said, through the 17, 1800s, there was this hashash, and it came from what they were fed. And then the shaila was, okay, so let's say we could control what they eat. So can we, how far before Pesach should they stop eating the chametz? Some places where that was relevant, so that was an option. If it was non-Jews that owned the cows, then you had more of an issue, or irreligious Jews that owned the cows, that was an issue. Uh, so yeah, these are. It's not like there've always been issues of different kinds, or the issues of whether there are kernels of grain being mixed into whatever. That could always have been an issue going back for forever. Um, but Dafka today, considering the resources that we technically do have at our disposal today, if someone really wanted to get proper schmaltz and free range and from a from farm that where they feed them only non chametz, not kitniyot, everything's possible if people actually cared enough about it. So yeah, just observing the word of schmaltz, but then not knowing what's going into the schmaltz, and then yeah, probably doing your own thing probably is always best. This word of doing it yourself, putting in the chumras and the hakpadas, the zhiris that you care about personally, or people like you care about, and a bunch of people chipping in together to do it right, is probably most in the spirit of how to do things versus just going through inertia. And yeah, if the schmaltz is worse than the alternatives, then yeah, I don't know. I mean, you still have the Milov, you're still doing things the way things were done on Mall, and the Zaydis of an Eiskabat, I already said this, the Svarat, the Zaydis of an Eiskabat, the Schmaltz shouldn't have a mechshel. They didn't daven that the canola oil or whatever shouldn't have a mechshel. So it doesn't have the Zaydis chosim. Okay, I don't know. And that's really for people to decide. But if you actually actively care about it and want to do something about it, there's so many options. I don't know 50 years ago how easy it was to get a machine to turn walnuts into oil. But today you can go on Amazon, or I don't know if the prices are going to change. You can throw in some current events. But as of not too long ago, you could go on Amazon and you could find whatever it is, $90, $100. You get a machine, and then you have to get all the nuts. Yeah, it's not. It's going to cost money. It's going to take time. It's going to involve effort. But you could do it yourself, and I think that would be more meaningful potentially than just taking the oil off the shelf, where especially with today's concerns about today's oils, where you don't even know where the oil's from. I mean, like from a health perspective, the vegetable oils and the seed oils, and so you have these oils where you can't even like fully identify what their source and origin is. They're just these modern commercial oils. So to me, this not Jewish related some of these concerns about the food that we consume and where it's sourced from and how it's produced, sort of in my mind at least crosses a bit with these concerns for Pesach. I see a certain commonality to them, and I see them through this Jewish Pesach lens of trying to watch what you're eating, and so it was up to, not if it was up to me, but adrabah, people ask, why do we do this Safkan Pesach? To me, it's fakir. To me, we should be doing, maybe we should be doing this a whole year. I think we'd be healthier. We'd be doing a lot better in many areas if you were. Only ate things that we could source ourselves, and that's why this idea is out there in a non-Jewish generic form. But Chach Pesach to do things right. That's, like I said, one of my titles that I like to share at Pesach time. But one final point, which is I mentioned about Shalom of Neustadt, Aril, Chassidim. So I just wanted to add this point that I came across this year that crystallized itself a bit for me this year, which is, like we mentioned earlier, that often today some of these chumras are associated with the Hasidic movement, even though they weren't strictly Hasidic, they weren't invented by the Hasidic movement. What's interesting is, like I said, the Chubba Me'ava alludes to the fact that he's not a Chassid, and like I said, I don't think he's referring to the Hasidic movement. I think he is using it in this older sense, and I think I spoke about it. I recorded some videos back in Kislev. I think I may have spoken about it in some of them. This idea of what does the word chassid mean? What does it mean to be a chassid? And maybe this is something to discuss another time at greater length. But to try to say it bekitzer, the term chassid in the Jewish world up until 250 years ago was a term that was fairly constantly in use, and it referred to people that, today we have a range of modes of observance, right? So we have all the way within, obviously, you have beyond the Orthodox, you have non-Orthodox Jews who still feel that they're observing Judaism in some meaningful way. Okay, and then within the range, the definition of Orthodox, which then you could also sort of stretch. There's some that consider themselves Orthodox, and maybe other Orthodox Jews, if they were aware of the nature of their practices, wouldn't feel comfortable associating themselves, feeling that they're in the same category. But no one's actively contesting the definition of Orthodox today. So if you call yourself Orthodox, you can you can get away with it, or whatever the right term is. Uh, Within the range that's considered Orthodox, you certainly have those all the way at the very end that are, not very observant, but still somewhat observant, keeping some of the very the basics. Um, so often, because we're siloed today, because we all are sort of living in our own community, and each community has its notion of what it considers observance. So someone who lives in Williamsburg certainly isn't thinking of themselves as being in the same category as someone in Teaneck. They're not really thinking about them at all. They're able to go through their whole lives without thinking about them. Um, and that's it's great, because that way we don't have machlekas and no one has to fight. And because if Williamsburg and Teaneck were forced to live together, I don't know how things would go over. So everyone, like I said, we're siloed based on level of observance. Even though what's happening is that within each community there is tension, because not everyone, which is the topic I wanted to get to, not everyone in the community actually fully believes and signs up for that level of observance. So it's not how it worked. Every community had multiple levels of observance. So you could have the guy at the top of the community who's like very firm, very stark, and at the very bottom you could have people that were, barely just keeping the basics. I think it was a lot more common. Obviously, I'm generalizing a lot here, and you probably would still have to go case by case, region by region, city by city, town by town. But I think it's still fair to generalize generally that within every region at any given time, you could see a much greater range of observance. And there was no branding. You weren't Chabad, you weren't Sabbath before these terms, before these labels were invented. Right? If you were just Ashkenaz, so within Ashkenaz you could be very from, you could be almost fry, or you could be kicked out. You could be in Cherem, you could be a Meshomad, Chas v'Shalom. It's completely out of the community. But you could go to any community in Ashkenaz at any given time, and you would find a tremendous range of, essentially, a microcosm of all the different labels that we have today. So today, everyone gathers in groups around a certain mode of observance, which you did not have in the past. This is one of the big shifts of the last 200 years, and it's completely redefined Judaism, the Jewish community, how Judaism is practiced is like a huge, huge shift that's sort of invisible to many people. People don't think about it or talk about it as much as we probably ought to be talking about it. Um, so, like I said, with kitniyot, even with kitniyot, you can see from the Shalom of Neustadt's tone that not everyone was keeping it, but they put their foot down and okay, everyone keeps it more or less. Um,
But
but
there was something about Kitnius that he saw the need to put his foot down more than, let's say, other Hanhagas, which were considered to be Hanhagas of the Fnimishur Sadin of sorts that were not, so he didn't seek to impose on everyone.
right, so what I want to point out is that the term chassid used to mean the top 0.1% or 1% or 5%, whatever, depending on the community, whatever, those people in the community that actually wanted to take things to the extreme, if you want to call it that, or they wanted to be very, very frum. Those that was the word Hasidim. Word Hasid was reserved for people like that. Around the time when the Hasidic movement launched, so the Hasidic movement definitely was partially about that, but also had other things that it emphasized until it sort of redefined the whole word chassid. And now you're a chassid of your Rebbe. Oh, I'm his chassid. I'm his chassid. That's an entirely novel use of what the word chassid means and how it's used. Um, but it was building on this existing notion of someone who does more, is misnag machasidus of nimishur sadin, in many areas. Like I said, when the Hasidic movement started, it was affiliated, it was associated with certain chumros in shatnez and gebrachs that other people were not doing, and that became branded and associated with this particular movement. Um, and what's interesting is that the Vilna Gaon was still known in his day as a chassid. In all the writings of his day, even the Alter Rebbe, when he writes about the Gra, he calls him Hachassid. Why was the Gra called Hachassid? Because he was very, very righteous, very, very pious, and he had withdrawn to the Klois to live this life of Hasidus. Um, but at some point, his Talmidim, when they came to Eretz Yisrael, they ended up branding themselves as the Prushim. Parush and Chassid essentially really meant more or less the same thing. They were just different flavors, at different times, different places, and different versions of what that meant. What were the details of your Hanhaga? Once the movement completely co-opted that term, so then the Prushim completely went with the term Prushim, and now ever since then, no one else is called a Chassid unless they are affiliated somehow with the Hasidic movement that traces itself to the Baal Shem Tov and the Maggid. But before that, you have this term used. So you have the Chassidim of Ashkenaz in the time of Yehuda Chassid. What's interesting is if you look in the Shalom of Neustadt, this is Shalom of Neustadt, in two places he mentions the Hasidim Rishonim of Neustadt. In one place, both of these passages are actually copied into Sefer Minhag Mariel. As we established, it's copied by Reb Zalman into the Sefer Minhag Mariel. One place he describes that he remembers that back in the day in Neustadt, there was someone who was so from he would only eat milchiks in one room and fleishiks in another room. That's one of them. A few other hanhagas that I don't even fully understand. And he says, and these were the Chassidim Rishonim of Neustadt. And then when it comes to Hilchos Pesach, or these Hanhagas of Pesach, he goes, the Chassidim Rishonim of Neustadt, they would not use, so in the Reb Shalom, it's not so clear, but in Minhag Maril, he copies it and he changes it or clarifies it to mean the oil derived from flax, linen oil, they called it. So linen oil, they treated pishtan like it had a din kitniyos. So, however, the original minhag was that shem and kitniyos, you can't use it for food, but you can use it for lighting, use it for hadlaka. The Chumash Hadashin writes this clearly. The Ramah brings it lahalacha, but the Shalom says that the Chassidim Rishonim would not even use it for hadlaka. That's how firm they were. And I was just noticing at this Pesach, and I noticed that in the Sefer of Shalom and the Sefer Ma'idel, no one has even made the connection between these two passages. So these are two passages that describe Chassidim Rishonim from Neustadt and their Hanhagas. What's interesting is that if you look in the back of Sefer Reb Shalom or Marash, you'll see that in different Kisvei Yad in the generation following, he himself is referred to and described as HaChassid Reb Shalom. Mariel, for example, I never saw anywhere that Mariel was called a Chassid, but Reb Shalom was called a Chassid. And it does not seem related to the Chassidei Ashkenaz from before. I saw it in the Mavai to Marash. They write that he's Chassidei Ashkenaz. They probably wrote that because they saw the word Chassid somewhere, but I'm not aware that that movement continued. There were big ruptures in Ashkenaz in the interim. And Reb Shalom himself says Chassidim Rishonim. The Chassidim Rishonim of Neustadt were a generation before him. So it seems like there was this mode in Austria, in Neustadt, there was this mode of frumkeit. And If you look in the Sefer Reb Shalom and the Sefer Maharil, you'll see that it's a whole bunch of chumras that Reb Shalom is the first to articulate. He said we don't drink meat, made vash, we don't drink on Pesach, even if it doesn't have chametz in it. We're not to use it. Karkaim, saffron, even if you grow it in your backyard, we don't use it. But he has a whole list of these things that sound like these types of chumras that we're familiar with today.
The
Not
minhag
every
of,
one is necessarily famous in that particular form till today. But this mode of, oh, we don't use this, we don't use that, we don't use that, we don't use dried figs, we don't use sugar, a whole list of things which are actually brought in Shulchan Aruch. You look in Ramah, you look in Al Tareb Shulchan Aruch, they actually are brought in Shulchan Aruch from via the Maharil. This Maharil, the Talmud copied them all into the Sefer. Uh, so you see, he's not attributing all of these to the Chassidim Rishonim, but to me, Reb Shalom Neustadt quoting the Chassidim Rishonim, speaking about them, very little documentation. We don't have this is all we know about them. But the fact that he's speaking about them approvingly and mentions them explicitly in the context of Pesach, and he's known as a chassid, and the fact that he's then going on the record and mentioning all these chumras, the way I see it, at least potentially, is that there is this identifiable streak of chassidus that even at that time, this is probably dargas and levels of how misnag b'chasidus you are, or how far from you are, but these are modes of expressions of being misnag b'chasidus. So whatever, then at some point, something like kitniyot becomes already enshrined that it's binding for everybody. So there's dargas. We're not putting everything in the same bucket, but so you have not being madlik. That's explicitly called the minhag of Chassidim Rishonim. Then you have kitniyot, that's binding for everybody. Then you have these things in the middle. It could be they were only noyeg in Ostreich, Lavdafka they were noyeg in Rhinus, and the minhag of Poland is known to be closer to Ostreich than it is to Rhinus. So I think Bechlal, if you look at Poland, my impression generally is that the mode of halacha and minhag in Poland was always more a little bit more forefront than Ashkenaz. So I would say potentially that there's certain roots, these invisible roots and patterns of how to practice halacha, how to practice minhag, of what type of minhagim occur to you naturally, and you want to observe them naturally. Um, there's this invisible process taking place in Österreich, and then I think later in Poland, and then the Hasidic movement later is sort of building on that. So even in this day and age, who are the people that are likely to continue these practices, which are not they weren't invented yesterday. In many cases, they do go back 5, 6, 700 years. But those that are misnag b'chasidus, that are identifiably Hasidim, it's building on that. It's not a completely new movement that's unrelated to previous modes of Hasidus. It's building on that. In some cases, I think the Polish version of Hasidus is in particular maybe building on earlier Polish modes of being misnag b'chasidus. Then
one
yeah,
obvious example, I think, that I mentioned to you in the past is that the minhag of waiting 6 hours between milk and meat is something which was not accepted in the Rhineland and Ashkenaz, in what, let's call it Western Ashkenaz.
right,
But it's pretty much for those who don't identify as today, they usually identify as yakas. For those who don't identify as yakas, most Ashkenazim nowadays are waiting 6 hours between milk and meat.
right.
I'm not
So
sure. I mean, that's not only a minhag of Chassidus, but it's just an example of something where in Österreich, Poland, etc. Obviously, the Ramah is Poland. You're much more. There's these more, again, to use the word extreme chumras in prishos and in Yonim to do with eating than there was in the original Ashkenaz.
right. These are ideas that need to be perhaps explored more, ironed out more. Um, but I think it's very important, very relevant to understanding how we got here or why we're doing what we're doing. All of these details are important, and in particular, these details about identifying Reb Shalom of Neustadt as being a key figure here, as opposed to Maharil. Although I'm assuming Maharil probably followed the Chumras of Reb Shalom, but a lot of these Chumras of Pesach, even if they're minhag Maharil, are really from Reb Shalom, and Reb Shalom is Dafka from Österreich, and Dafka seems to be perhaps associated with Hasidim of Neustadt. So I think that was that in particular was, I guess you could say, the chiddush for me this year in pinpointing, because a lot of this is very murky. A lot of this stuff is sort of murky at the beginning, at the origins, but to sort of zero in and nail down this particular source, and this part about Reb Shalom being the source is very, very overlooked. Like I said, many Sfarim today will just quote it from Maril, even this Rabbi Yaakov from Belz. I paid attention. Oh, he'll say, oh, Maril says that we do X, Y, and Z. But in the passage that he quotes Maril, it says Amar Maharash, which is not Maril, it's Maharash, and it's not even Maril, it's Reb Zalman quoting from the book of Maharash's Hanhagas. So that awareness is lacking for everybody, including myself, up until a few weeks ago. So, if we want to talk about, pinpoint with the best accuracy that we can where certain Hanhagas of Pesach started, Shalom of Neustadt is a key overlooked figure in that discussion. Now, to circle back around to the larger point I wanted to make, which I guess maybe for a separate discussion, is what is the state of Chassidus today? And I mean specifically and particularly with emphasis on minhage Chassidus, being misnahig by Chassidus, because we're all sort of, like I said, we're all tagged with certain labels. What we're seeing is I don't know what percentage it is, but within Chabad, even within the Chassidish world, we're seeing it more and more. There is a nice slice of the population that isn't really emotionally, etc., fully on board with being misnahig with all of these chumros, hidurim, not just on Pesach, but a whole year round. And you're just getting that tension between the fact that they identify in a certain way, and that identity is so important to that label is so important to their identity. So, like, if you're Chabad, you don't want to drop the Chabad label. If you're Hasidish, you don't want to drop the Hasidish label, because there's just so much meaning around it. Even if it's just culturally, if you grew up speaking Yiddish and you're never going to speak English without an accent, so you're labeled Hasidish for life. That's what Chassidish means nowadays at its core. So you're labeled. Obviously, again, that's also just an old Ashkenazi. People in Ashkenaz spoke Yiddish until 100 years ago. That's another discussion. But if you're you're identifying as Chassidish on the one hand, on the other hand, you barely want to keep the basics. So emotionally, spiritually, you're maybe more modern Orthodox than ultra Orthodox. So we're getting just a lot of this. We're getting a lot of this discourse, a lot of this discomfort, a lot of the conversations we're seeing on podcasts or conversations we're seeing online. People that are sort of trapped between between their identity versus where they are where they want to be emotionally, spiritually. I think if you go back 150 years, depends on the region, depends, but certainly I think in Chabad, for example, I think fathers and sons, I think sons were slipping in and out of the identity. If a son didn't care for the Rebbe, for the Chassidus, they simply stopped identifying as a Chassid, and it was that easy. There were no meistas, it was just either you're card carrying, dues paying member, or you're not, and so you didn't have to continue with identity. Today, obviously, we don't have that. And obviously, it's probably a good thing that even people who don't fully want to identify with all the minhagim of Chassidus still have that identity, still have that connection. Surely, we assume it's a good thing. I'm sure that's in Chabad, that's what the Rebbe would want. That it should be a big tent, a big umbrella. Even people that are varying levels of observance still have that connection. So, not saying that it was better back then, but comparing now to then, I think would be helpful for explaining why we're seeing such a large number of people that are not really comfortable with the full set of behaviors. And I think that's, historically speaking, that's fine. It's normal. It's not abnormal. Um, right? So every person, to some extent, I do believe that every person, when they get married as an adult, they do get to ask themselves, do I want to keep all these? It's happening anyway, to one extent or another. It's happening in a very drawn out, maybe somewhat unpleasant process. But if someone wants to say, I don't fully identify as someone who is misnahig b'chasidus. I try to keep the basics, and I have my list of things, and I have certain anagas. Maybe I learn chitas and rama, whatever their chassidish anagas are. But it's just, I think, important to have a stronger. I've jokingly said before, we should make a checklist of how chassidish or how chassidic are you? What do you actually do or care for or observe? Um, so it just would be helpful for people. You could find it's happening again. It's happening organically anyway, but you know, just like today in the macro, you have these labels, so where, okay, I'm Chabad, you're Chabad, we're on the same page supposedly. I'm Chassidish, you're Chassidish, Bell, Satmar. Even though as the communities keep on growing, what you're finding is you're finding completely different groups. Like I've said before, even within Chabad, you have the Satmar Sheba Chabad and the Breslov Sheba Chabad and the Modern Orthodox Sheba. You end up People end up breaking down around these types of personality types and groups anyway. Um, maybe it's just better to acknowledge it somewhat, and then it just makes the conversation easier, as opposed to everyone uses the term Chabad, and then there's this confusion. Well, what does Chabad do? Well, people can come and speak in the name of Chabad and say Chabad does X, Y, and Z, but then you'll say, well, I know a lot of Chabad people, and they're not doing that at all. Okay, so what is this? Gets to the larger question of identity, Chabad identity. Other podcasts are certainly exploring that in their way. Um, but it's something that I think about even in this context of uh, Pesach observance and Chabad identity, and you have those that are, like I said, they come from Russia and they have they trace their family. We've been part of Chabad. We do things. This is the way we do things. You have that minhag. You have that, and clearly the Rebbeim are also coming from that context, and they also did things quite similarly, whether or not everything was written down or not. Um, and you have many other levels and versions of Chabad identity, which are not necessarily doing all those things. People from those families who don't feel who are not thrilled and excited about doing those things. And I think there
Or
is some room to say that should you be doing those things if you don't enjoy them and it's not pleasant. And I would hope that this type of discussion and being able to delve into it and being able to obviously we need to touch every chumrah, but tracing the chumrah and connecting with the more distant past and seeing the larger context could perhaps make it more meaningful for some. But for some, like we said, Simchas Yom Tov, you have a notion in your mind of what you want to eat, what you like to eat, and not having certain foods is Amish Hapach Simchas Yom Tov. So historically, L'chaira, being a chassid meant that you wanted to be a chassid, not that someone's forcing you.
you're feeding into what I was just going to sort of say to myself or out loud as a takeaway is that there's the specific questions of do I use sugar, do I use oil, do I use potato starch, or whatever it is. And as you alluded to in the beginning, there's nowadays maybe factors that factor in that didn't exist or that weren't relevant once upon a time. But a helpful tool, the way I see it, is it, to approach the question from the point of view of am I a person, and do I strive to be a person who incorporates hanhagas of chassidus, of precious, of the fnimusher sadin into my life, and to what extent am I happy to forego on personal comfort and preferences in gashmias for the benefit of pursuing that higher goal? And the answer doesn't have to be static. Sometimes it might be, Chevy Potzadik will come. Sometimes you have more, identify more with one than the other. But that's the question is in that genre of questions. It's not just a specific question of do I see any chashash chametz or any specific value in not eating oil or not eating potato starch or whatever it is.
Right. And it is interesting that a lot of this was taken not recorded and spread by the Rebbe as formal minhag Chabad. So there is something interesting to be said about that. So maybe that was the Rebbe's way of being maktim refuah, and people should be able to identify as Chabad and feel part of Chabad, and not feel like they are uh, officially at odds with the official minhag Chabad, which is something that the Frierdiker Rebbe and the Rebbe sort of coined and created anyway, which is his own discussion. Maybe that's also that's part of it, and that it's interesting category of minhagim that are Chabad affiliated, Chabad associated, and practiced by the Rebbeim and all the Chashuvim Mishpachas. But ultimately, if you come from an American family and you've been eating X, Y, and Z, there's no clear marker that says. As far as I remember, Sefer Menhagim doesn't say, "Well, we don't have commercial, we don't need." A lot of these things are not
And also a lot of
stipulated.
lifestyle things. I mean, one thing that comes to mind, not related to the specifics of Pesach, but just like lifestyle things, that in one of the Rebbe's letters or sichos or something about making kiddush b'shar shvius, so there's a psaloshin kachra isi noagim. So the Rebbe added, "Come over not by my shver or by my father, because they anyway made kiddush very late, But I'm saying I'm about. In other words, the Rebbe is coming from a place of Chassidus. Both obviously the Frierdiker Rebbe and Rebbe Leivik were very people who were misnag in oifen of Kedusha and Chassidus, and anyway, they weren't rushing to eat. They were davening ba'avodah. They were learning Chassidus, whatever they were doing. But it's like, okay, but now we're trying to apply this minhag of not making kiddush b'shar shvius to a regular family who you want to may sit down and eat right away. So okay, so now how do you apply that?
Right. So there's a lot of this going on in the background of a lot of prati and haggis, and to acknowledge the reality. Not everyone is on the same level with Pale Mamish. In these discussions, I think it is important to acknowledge these tiers, tiers of Hanhaga, and like I said, even when it comes to the oil, so Tzemach Tzedek, I assume was surely using schmaltz, but he's discussing there's the dalas ha'am, the more automated people, they use this oil, they use that oil. There clearly were levels of, and not all those levels were recorded. They only come up with regard to shilas. Certain shilas came up where what they were doing was so questionable that the Paiskim had to intervene. But there's always been certain.
There's even a letter from the Rebbe from probably from the Shins, if not from the either from the Yud or the Shins, where he reports somebody asked about minhag anash in America, and the Rebbe said, yeah, anash in America used a specific type of oil, which if I recall correctly, Rabbi Shochat was mevar that it was a peanut oil that was prevalent at the time. But whatever. I mean, the Rebbe again, as minhag anash just means what people here do. The Rebbe is not being kevei minhag Chabad to do that or not to do that, but it's also another sort of window into what was going on in most people's houses that the Rebbe was familiar with in the early days of Chabad in America.
Right. It was also, of course, a time of rupture, and people had not been living normal lives for 20 years straight, and wherever everyone had been displaced and physically and spiritually. So it took time for things to settle back down anyway. Um, so I don't remember the exact maskana about that letter or what product that Rebbe was referring to, so I don't want to go on the record here without being 100% sure. But it does seem like the Rebbe was being somewhat more lenient than the person who had been asking had thought. And then, but Chassidim are using that, or among Chassidim are those who are using that, whatever product that was. Um, so certainly Pesach is taka a time, like I said, where sometimes it's trickier. If let's say Gebracht, Gebracht doesn't seem to be really negotiable within Chabad, within the Chassidic world. But there seem to be many other things that are taka somewhat semi-negotiable. They're not etched in stone. So everyone should taka. Ideally, everyone should come and want to do everything on the most the level possible. But if someone's not feeling it, then at least in my opinion, at least b'derech afshir, there is room to try to bring your anhaga and your mindset in line with each other, and there's always room for growth. But again, obviously, it depends case by case, and I'm not here to give any specific sak and hayra, but food for thought.
All right, this was very good. Extended a little longer than we intended, but it was geschmack. Thank you.
Yeah, if anyone makes it all the way this far, hi. Yeah, all right. Pesach. I don't know if we'll get a chance to do any between now and Pesach, but this should keep people busy between this one and the next one.
All right, very good.